Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this important conversation to further kick off 2026, which has already proven to be an action-packed year. I remind our audience that we are only the second full week of the year. I'm Jason Marzak, Vice President, Senior Director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council. Today's show is a signature annual event of the center where we do what drives us throughout the year. We look ahead to give you, our audience, insights to help drive your thinking and approach to various issues. So thanks for tuning in to 2026 in the Americas, stories that may drive the news. The year is kicked off with the very welcome and seismic development of Nicolas Maduro now in a New York jail. And this center, along with the broader Atlantic Council, has been leading the analysis from every angle and will continue to unpack what may come next. We are ready for this moment, having launched our Venezuela work back in 2017. Just a few weeks ago, we put our 10 defining questions for the year, with the first one being whether Maduro would be in power. Our answer then was, hopefully not. And we thankfully got that right. This is the first concrete action of President Trump's new national security strategy, with a clear message that the Western Hemisphere is now the U.S.'s top foreign policy priority. Clearly, 2026 promises to be one of the most consequential years for the region. It is yet another year of key elections scheduled for Costa Rica, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and the Bahamas. In particular, the Colombian election will be closely watched. As discussed in our recently released 10 Questions publication, key issues of economic prosperity, development, investment, security, and democracy loom large for Latin America and the Caribbean this year. At a moment when our hemisphere is front and center, a moment where we are made for at ALAC, I want to highlight the important role that journalists played to untangle the sometimes very complicated and interesting stories across the region. The conversation today will shed light on what topics to watch and why these stories matter for the world. And this conversation is also a teaser for all the work we will be doing this year to advance key priorities, from USMCA to Argentina's economic acceleration, from how to really transform Venezuela to how to reignite the U.S.-Colombia relationship, and from steps to accelerate investment in key regional sectors to rebalance the role of China. I'd like to begin by extending a very warm welcome to all our speakers today. From the Financial Times, we are joined by Michael Stott, Latin American editor. From NBC News, welcome to Courtney Cube, Senior National Security and Pentagon Correspondent. From Bloomberg, Eric Martin, State Department and Foreign Policy Reporter. From the Miami Herald, the Caribbean Correspondent, Jacqueline Charles. And from Telemundo Network, we are joined by Javier Vega, National Correspondent. Thank you all for tuning in today via ACTV, including our founder, Adrian Arch, who's online. I will now turn the discussion over to Salome Ramirez Vargas, Assistant Director of Communications at ALAC, and a former journalist herself, who was previously with Voice of America.
Thank you, Jason, for setting the stage for this important conversation and for the introductions. Good morning to everyone tuning in through our social media channels, YouTube and ACTV. And thank you, of course, to our speakers for joining us today to discuss what already are and what could become the defining stories of the year. As a journalist myself, I greatly admire your work, and I'm very much looking forward to your insights. But before we begin, a quick note for those watching: you can be part of this conversation by submitting questions for our speakers through askac.org, that is askac.org. I'll be monitoring those questions and may bring a few into the discussion as time allows. So we have about 50 minutes together. So with that, let me jump right into our first question. And before we dive deeper into the developments in Venezuela, which of course have dominated headlines across Latin America over the past week, I want to start with a story unfolding this week that relates to trade and to one of the most economic significantly developments of the region. After more than 25 years of negotiations, the European Union and Mercosur are now away from signing their free trade agreement, with the latest timeline pointing to January 17. We expect the signing to be today, but it got moved to later in the week. The deal covers Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Bolivia, and would create one of the world's largest free trade areas. So, Michael, I want to start with you talking about this agreement. Can you walk us through the key things that we should understand about the agreement, and what impact could it have across South America, particularly when it comes to EU investment and modernization of key industries?
Well, thank you, Salome, and a real pleasure to be with you all here. Thanks to Atlantic Council for the invitation. A great admirer of all the terrific work you do during the year. I'm speaking to you from Bogota today, where I'm waiting to see if I can get into Venezuela, along with about 1,000 other reporters. We shall see. So Mercosur is quite a long way from my thoughts, but you're quite right that it's a very important deal. And I think Actually, the main importance initially is a symbolic one. It's a political and diplomatic one. It's Latin America trying to show and Europe trying to show that in an era where there is a big threat to established alliances, established world order, that it's the law of the strongest, the law of the jungle, that there can still be institutional mechanisms and that Latin America has options. Latin America is not squeezed between the US and China. It does have Europe as a trade partner too, an important trade and investment partner. And this agreement is a major step forward if indeed it does proceed, because I think there are still one or two bridges to cross. My understanding is one of them is the European Parliament has to vote to agree this deal. And that is not a totally foregone conclusion. But it will be important symbolically. There is grumbling on both sides. I think the Brazilians, particularly the Argentines, are upset that the additional safeguards put into the agreement at the last minute to placate European farmers make it less attractive for them. They're quite worried about some of the industrial competition that could come from Europe. And likewise, on the European side, there's a lot of disquiet in the very strong farming lobby in the EU about being flooded with all sorts of Latin American agricultural produce from a very efficient agro industry in Brazil and Argentina, which smaller European farmers simply can't compete with. There's worries about environmental issues, destruction of the Amazon, and so on. So it's not going to be an easy or smooth agreement. But I think the leaders on both sides, on the Latin American side and the European side, will be very, very happy if they can finally get this over the line after 25 years at a crucial moment internationally and show that European Latin American relations still mean something in an era where the US and China seem to be taking all the headlines.
Thank you, Michael. That really helps to frame how trade and investment dynamics are shifting across the region. And we're going to come back to that. And for everyone watching, you can head to atlanticcouncil.org to read analysis from our experts on what comes next for this agreement. We will also, of course, be closely following Michael's coverage of the subject. And we'll see if you're able to get to Venezuela, Michael. Please keep us updated on that. So I want to turn now, in fact, to Venezuela. And of course, on January 3rd, the United States executed an operation in Caracas that resulted in the arrest of Nicolás Maduro, who is now in custody in New York. Courtney, I want to turn to you now. Saturday's operation appears to be the first concrete deliverable of President Trump's new national security strategy, as our experts wrote shortly after the arrest. How should we interpret this in terms of future U.S. engagement in the region?
Well, thank you for having me. I'm totally jealous of Michael. I hope you get into Venezuela and take me with you as your intern. The U.S. engagement in the Western Hemisphere, I think under President Trump at this point knows no bounds. It's exactly as the national security strategy, which the Atlantic Council has written about. It's exactly as they lay out. There is this idea that they want to focus primarily on this hemisphere because they consider that to be the biggest potential for where there could be threats to the U.S. So it's not just militarily. They are worried about growing and increasing influence by the Chinese and by others in the region. We saw that early on in the Trump administration when they started discussing the potential for an invasion of Panama to try to push the Chinese out of Panama. As far as Venezuela, the big difference here is the tremendous military action. And when I say tremendous, I mean the investment of military that has been taken specifically for Venezuela. And I don't just mean this raid last weekend, now almost 10 days ago, I guess it was, to capture Nicolas Maduro and his wife, but the investment that has existed since late summer, late August or so, when the U.S. started flooding the area. Now there's more than well over 15,000 U.S. troops. There are ships, surface and submarine ships. There are aircraft there, everything from fighter jets to drones, surveillance aircraft. They have pulled them from other parts of the world, other regions, because they want to show the emphasis on this region. And while President Trump has said that he has now called back a second wave or a second strike in Venezuela, and we can discuss whether that was ever really on the table because the objective of that and the actual target is completely unclear. While he has called that back, one thing that defense officials are very clear about is there is no stopping, there is no slowing down the other military action that we've seen in the region recently, and that is going after the alleged drug boats, more than 30 of them now, more than 100 people killed, and stopping, seizing, boarding, and seizing these oil tankers that are coming out of Venezuela. So the military action there really is showing no signs of slowing down. And you know, we're already hearing talk about the potential for the U.S. trying to get more involved some way in Cuba. There's still Panama, Greenland, and I would not discount the Trump administration putting more and more effort into Mexico. We've already started to see a little bit of daylight of them talking about that, in the way in the administration saying that now fentanyl, they're considering that a weapon of mass destruction. That is the big drug threat that comes into the United States. And the reality is we know the vast majority of it is coming across the land from Mexico into the United States. So I think that Mexico is another thing that we will be hearing about. 2026 will be the year that the Trump administration focuses on the Western Hemisphere even more. And the big question is, if there are other world events that draw the military apparatus into looking in other parts of the world, will the U.S. respond or not? It's coming at the expense of other regions, that's for sure too.
Super interesting, Courtney. Thank you. And we're actually going to go back to those deployments and foreign policy approach. But I want to turn to the diplomatic implications and of what comes next. And with that, I want to turn to Eric. You've been closely tracking how Washington is approaching this moment. Last week, you even published an exclusive on early steps the Trump administration is taking that could allow for the reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela. What are you hearing from your sources about how serious this effort is, what conditions Washington is attaching to it, and whether this could realistically begin to reestablish diplomatic relations after years of rupture?
Thank you, Salome. And I also want to thank Jason and Adrian for having me in the Atlantic Council. Honored to be with you this morning. I think that what you're talking about in terms of the embassy reopening is crucial to U.S. involvement and U.S. plans for, in the words of President Trump, running Venezuela, and Secretary Rubio's words, running policy in Venezuela. The embassy was closed in 2019 after some saber rattling from Maduro following the 2018 election, which was widely rejected not only by the U.S. but by European partners. And there were diplomats who at the time felt that the U.S. should have actually maintained its presence. This was a decision made when Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State. They were concerned about protests and the amount of conflict around the embassy and the potential for escalation to violence or an attack on the embassy. The U.S. made the decision to pull personnel out. They were moved to Bogota and to Colombia. Venezuelan Affairs Unit was established. But this is something that there's just no substitute for, having people on the ground being able to meet with, one, the army and the military, two, to engage with politicians of all different ideologies, both in the opposition and people actually in government in Caracas, as well as the ability to travel around the country. Of course, we saw over the weekend the other side of this, which was the U.S. saying that Americans should leave Venezuela and sounding a warning about colectivos and potential threats to people who are identified as American. So that also hangs over this. One thing I'd like to touch upon that you just spoke about with Courtney, and I agree with Courtney that about the emphasis on the Western Hemisphere this year, and also with Jason's piece last week about this being the first deliverable of the national security strategy. But I think that the national security strategy is an articulation of a strategy that was already de facto in place. I cover the State Department, and I traveled with Secretary Rubio on his trip to Central America and Dominican Republic almost 1 year ago. He became the first Secretary of State since Philander Knox in 1909 to make their first solo trip to Latin America, with all the places in the world to choose from. And we saw even then in Panama, I reported that the Panamanian government was considering canceling the contracts of C.K. Hutchinson, a Hong Kong ports company with ports on both sides of the Panama Canal, as well as the announcement during that trip that Panama would withdraw from China's Belt and Road Initiative, which was quite important, one of the first countries to announce plans to actually withdraw from that, and seeing some of the requirements and the hidden cost of China's signature development program. And so I think we actually started to see, even a year ago, some of this countering of China's influence in the region. That said, it's going to be very hard overall to do that. China is the biggest trade partner for a number of countries, particularly in South America. And, so this is something that we are going to be following as a storyline throughout the year. But I think that this is a year in which we can expect the U.S. to really assert itself in the hemisphere, both through the hard power, like we saw with the capture of Nicolás Maduro, but also through soft power in terms of endorsements of candidates. We already saw that with Tito Asfura, president-elect in Honduras, and President Trump speaking out on that election. And so I think that that's something to watch with the number of elections this year, Peru, Colombia, Brazil, number of elections in the hemisphere.
Thank you, Eric. I think you've laid out a lot of the most important headlines that are going to be for the year, not only Chinese influence in the region, but also the elections. And Courtney was just talking about the Caribbean security deployment that it's still in the region. So I want to turn to Jacqueline because, of course, governments in the Caribbean are closely watching how these developments unfold and what they could mean for regional security dynamics. So, Jacqueline, from your reporting, how are governments viewing the U.S. operation in Venezuela, and what are they watching most closely as U.S. military deployments and security activity remains so present in the region?
Well, I have to tell you, I mean, governments are actually watching their own individual relationships right now with this administration. I mean, we saw up until the 3rd of January, the U.S. deployment in the Southern Caribbean really divide member states of CARICOM. We saw Trinidad's prime minister being a very strong advocate of this. We didn't hear much from Guyana, but we know that they're very close to the U.S., so they were basically, practicing quiet diplomacy. But what we have seen now in the last week or so is at least 6 members of CARICOM that have basically caved in and given to these third-party agreements with the United States as far as accepting deportees, migrants, whatever label you want to give it to each country, basically carving out, their own, agreement saying, here's who we will accept, here's who we will not accept. And this is very interesting when you think about the Caribbean and their own relationship as far as accepting their own deportees and the problems that they've had with that. And, here they are sort of, caving to pressure, even while they tried to spin this. This is just part of their bilateral agreements. So that is one of the first, fallouts that we are seeing here. CARICOM itself is going to meet as a body next month, February in St. Kitts. We're waiting to see, how that meeting unfolds, what positions they take. Last year in Barbados, you had the European Union. Interesting, we were talking about trade. I mean, they said to Europe, hey, we are still here. Europe is still here. We still believe in climate change. We are a partner for CARICOM countries. So we were watching to see whether or not more of them will make more of an advance toward Europe, but they still want that relationship with the United States. China is also present in the region. So how does that relationship, Belt and Roads in Jamaica and other countries? So there's a lot to look for in terms of really the reaction, not just in terms of what's happening in the Southern Caribbean, but in terms of the relationship between the United States and, the Caribbean itself.
Definitely. Thank you, Jacqueline. And I want to stay on Venezuela for just a moment longer before we zoom out to the rest of the region. So, Courtney and Eric, 2 quick follow-ups. Courtney, in the hours and days since the operation, what do you think U.S. defense and intelligence officials are most concerned about? What's next? Is it fragmentation inside Venezuela? Is it the effect on neighboring countries? Or is it maybe a legal and diplomatic fallout from the operation itself?
I think it's all of the above. The legal piece definitely seemed to be a very big deal. The idea of whether this was a legal operation or not, whether the U.S. violated international law by carrying out this military operation, it was similar to what we've heard about the alleged drug boat strikes, right? There have been people in Congress, definitely experts and lawyers, retired military JAGs, who've been questioning the legality of it, but it doesn't seem to be resonating within the Trump administration. It doesn't seem to be changing anything about what they're doing. One thing that I do hear a lot of concern about from officials is the notion that the U.S. owns this now. And how long could that last? And I'm even hearing people who are comparing it to things like Iraq. Obviously, this is a completely different situation. The US military went in there and they left. They didn't leave a follow-on force. They didn't, it wasn't a persistent fighting, but President Trump and senior officials around him have said very openly that they want to run Venezuela. It is an open-ended idea. And what does that mean? And if in fact things start to go south, if there is chaos, if there are economic issues, whatever it may be, will the Trump administration actually own that? And what will that look like? There is a lot of concern about that because while the military operation, putting aside any legality, aside any of that, it was planned for months and it was carried out and it was successful in that it achieved the objective that the administration and the military have told us of what their ultimate objective was. The planning for what comes the next day does not seem to have been anywhere near to the same level. And so that seems to be the biggest concern, is some sort of internal strife. You know, in the immediate hours after the raid, we saw citizens running to the grocery store, running to the pharmacy. They were worried. They didn't know what was going to happen. And while that may have calmed down a bit, we could still see more of that if there is more further instability. The other thing that I think is with that, the Trump administration's inability or unwillingness, whatever it is, to really lay out what they see as the path forward here for Venezuela. That only causes more instability, and that could then lead to what we have seen them fall back on when there is instability, and that is relying on the military to move in and answer a problem that they don't know how to fix.
Can I quickly follow up on that, Courtney? So the possibility of a meeting between Maria Corina Machado and Donald Trump, how does that play out into those dynamics?
I mean, that is the biggest question here because President Trump has, while he seemed warm to her several months ago, then he started saying things that were somewhat disparaging of her ability to be a leader in the aftermath of this raid. So what does President Trump want? And is that what's going to matter as far as who is the next leader here in Venezuela? I mean, it's been remarkable to see how this has unfolded over the last 10 days or so. In the immediate aftermath here, we all started asking, what about political prisoners? What about the people who are being held in Venezuela? Was that ever part of these talks that existed apparently for months between President Trump's senior officials and Maduro's inner circle? And those are some of the questions that we don't have here. Is it possible we'll see more political prisoners that are released? And could that weigh into how the government goes forward? But again, these are all the questions we just don't have fidelity on.
Yes, Michael, I believe you want to jump in here.
Yeah, thanks, Salome. I just wanted to add, I think one of the risks no one's really talking about in Venezuela is the Venezuelan people, right? No one's asked them actually what they think, what they want, whether they agree with any of this, whether they're happy with a Delcy Rodriguez government, whether they like the Rubio plan. And they, to me, are the real wild card in all of this. I think it's fairly clear over the last week, we've seen quite a good working relationship emerge between Delcy Rodriguez and Marco Rubio. Early days, for sure. Lots of pressure on both of them. But so far, they're collaborating quite effectively to get oil moving, to get shipments on the way, to do the legal and financial plumbing necessary to sell that oil and get some money back to Venezuela. That bit's working. The bit nobody knows about is where the Venezuelan people stand and whether they will show themselves at some point via demonstrations or whether they will simply accept all this and go along with it. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. And just last question on Venezuela, and I want to turn to Eric because I want to know your perspective about also neighbors. So what kind of responses should we be watching from key regional actors like Colombia and Mexico? And you were just talking about this earlier, but how seriously are U.S. officials preparing for potential diplomatic pushback with neighboring countries?
Sure, Salome. So I actually was just in Mexico for several weeks. I got back on Saturday. And what I would say is that there are, for instance, for President Sheinbaum, she actually spoke with President Trump just this morning. We got a readout from the Mexican side of that call maybe an hour ago. And I was on Secretary Rubio's trip to Mexico in September, where they signed an agreement. President Sheinbaum and Secretary Rubio signed an agreement towards more collaboration on intelligence and other things. Secretary Rubio has been effusive in his praise for President Sheinbaum, talking about how Mexico has been cooperating more than ever before. One wonders whether the U.S. capture of Maduro and going into Venezuela in this way, which is being seen in the international community as an act of war, in some members of the international community at the United Nations, and whether that will put limits on Sheinbaum's ability to cooperate, partly because of domestic factors. Remember that she comes from this Cuatro T, this movement started by her political patron, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And there are a lot of kind of hard left people within that movement who want to see less cooperation with the U.S., including potentially her predecessor, AMLO himself. And so there are domestic political constraints on her ability to cooperate with the U.S., even if there are people like Omar Garcia Harfuch, Secretary of Public Security, who see that as in Mexico's interests, in Mexico's self-interest, to rein in and to counter the impact and the power of the drug cartels in Mexico. Quickly on Colombia. Colombia has been fascinating, actually. I mean, seeing from President Petro having his visa revoked in late September after his comments in the streets of New York about calling on American troops to disobey potentially immoral, in his view, orders from the president. From that to just 3 months later now being invited to the White House in this call he just had with President Trump, and now reporting that he's going to be in Washington in early February, is just fascinating. And we've seen Secretary Rubio talk about the expectation that Colombians will choose a more centrist path, more in line with, from the U.S., expectation and hope, more in line with traditional cooperation with the U.S., which has been the paradigm for Colombia for decades until Petro's election. But of course, we've seen also Cepeda being strong in initial polling several months before the election in Colombia. So I think what we're going to see here from the U.S. is a realistic view of the region and how the U.S. can have influence and impact. But it's going to be hard. I mean, the act of going in to Venezuela and in this unilateral way, I think, has definitely made it more challenging in the U.S. in some ways to collaborate with some of the governments in the region, primarily because of their domestic political constraints.
Right. Thank you, Eric. I think you just laid out the perfect segue to the next section of the conversation. Zooming out a bit from Venezuela and looking more broadly at how political shifts across the region could reshape those U.S. relations in the year ahead. So I want to turn to Javier now. Javier, we were just talking about how several countries across Latin America face elections or political transitions in 2026. And of course, these are going to be key not only for U.S. relationships with these countries, but with the dynamics in the region in general. From your reporting, which races could prove most consequential for those U.S. relations? And of course, as Eric was just mentioning, particularly Colombia, there was a lot of tensions between President Trump and President Petro, and now they have a meeting planned in the White House for early February.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Salome. Thank you for the opportunity. It's an honor to be here with some of the most respected journalists I know. And yes, Eric already talked a little bit about this, but this is a very important year. The calendar has presidential elections in Costa Rica, Peru, Haiti, but I would say most importantly in two of the biggest democracies in the region, Brazil and Colombia. I was recently in that press conference that Secretary Rubio gave, and he did a very clear distinction, according to him, between two types of countries in the hemisphere, those who cooperate with Washington and those who don't. It is also important to remember that President Trump was very open during 2025 about his preferences in terms of winners or expected results in several elections in Latin America that happened in Ecuador, that happened in Argentina, most recently in Honduras. And in every case, the result was the one that President Trump wanted. I would certainly say that Colombia is probably the most consequential election this year. We have this leftist president, Gustavo Petro, who was very critical of Trump administration. Just like Eric just mentioned, his visa was revoked. Secretary Rubio called him unstable. And now, after what happened on January the 3rd, he's willing to talk, and he's willing to amend his relation with President Trump. For now, just a phone call with President Trump changed the entire dynamic in the Colombian presidential race. Before that, Petro was using nationalism, patriotism, I would say also like anti-imperialism sentiment to rally voters for his candidate, Ivan Cepeda. And this was being used by the right-wing candidate, Juan Daniel Oviedo, to criticize Petro for creating an international crisis with the United States. We'll see what happens really in the Oval Office. But I remember when I interviewed Petro at the very beginning of his government, the one-on-one I had with him when he came to the United Nations, and he said to me that his biggest political legacy would be to give the government to a new president that would continue his political vision and his political legacy. So just like the Chavistas in Venezuela, I think what happened in Caracas on January the 3rd has shaken the region entirely, and many politicians are putting aside idealisms, ideology, and they're just being pragmatic for their own benefit. Petro wants his candidate to win, and it's clear that he is doing what he thinks is necessary.
Thank you, Javier. These races that we're definitely going to be watching at ALAC as the year unfolds. And I want to turn now back to trade and back to Michael. We opened today by discussing the EU-Mercosur agreement, which is reshaping how Europe and South America engage economically. But there is another major trade agreement in the hemisphere approaching a critical moment. So, Michael, the USMCA review process, that is, of course, the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, is approaching a moment, the review process is approaching at a moment of heightened political tension in North America. What early signals are you tracking about how contentious that review could become, and what would a rocky process mean for investor confidence across the region? You are on mute, Michael.
Apologies. Yes, sorry. Thank you, Salome. Just before I answer that, since I'm in Bogota, I just wanted to add to what Javier said. I think
please.
It's extraordinary in Colombia that 4 years after we saw a highly polarized election between a radical left-wing candidate and a sort of very unpalatable right-wing candidate who was an anti-establishment type, we're back in the same place again. 4 years later, we've got a radical left candidate, Petro's successor, Ivan Cepeda, and leading the polls, an impresentable, as many Colombians call him, de la Espriella, a sort of mini Bukele, come from nowhere, a very dubious past, lots of links to dubious people in the Colombian establishment and outside the establishment. And that's the choice that voters may face in the election if the center can't get its act together. So I agree entirely with Javier. I think it's a very consequential election, and there's an awful lot to play for. And we have to just hope that a centrist candidate emerges in the meantime between now and then that's credible and that actually stands a chance. Otherwise, I think it's quite a bleak scenario for Colombia. So to turn to Mexico and your question, Salome, yes, there's a lot at stake, an enormous amount at stake. One of the most important trading relationships in the world. The US-Mexico trading relationship. The formal review begins on the 1st of July, but the battle lines are already being drawn. We know that President Trump is not happy with the current USMCA agreement, although it was one that was signed under his first administration. He'll be seeking as many concessions as he can extract from Mexico, particularly on keeping China out of supply chains and out of the Mexican market. And we've seen already steps by President Sheinbaum to placate him on that front by tightening up Chinese imports, imposing more tariffs and making life generally more difficult for Chinese investment in Mexico. There are energy disputes too because of Sheinbaum's government's very pro-state policies on energy that she inherited from her predecessor. I think the issue for Mexico is they have very little leverage in these talks. They're enormously dependent on the US market. 80% of exports or more go to the US. They really have very little to argue. The only thing they can say to the Americans is, you need us if you want to have a strong Americas and keep China out. You need us to compete with China globally. We can help you make your manufacturers more competitive. But it's not particularly an argument Trump wants to hear. He's been extremely clear that he sees Made in America as his trademark. He wants to see the factories in America. The factories in Mexico supplying America is not really good enough for him. And of course, if there's no extension to USMCA in its current form, then what you go into is a series of annual reviews. And quite a few people think what may well happen is that Trump triggers that mechanism because that way he can keep more leverage over Mexico. He can avoid prolonging the agreement with some modifications in its current form and keep the pressure on with annual reviews, which of course is not what business want. It's not what investors want. But it may be inevitable given the current dynamics. I think what you hear a lot from Mexican and US business is that common sense ought to prevail, that there's so much at stake, that this is a relationship that clearly makes sense for both sides. It would be crazy to lose it. But in the current political climate, obviously nothing is for sure.
Michael, and do you think that the World Cup being hosted by the three nations will have any impact, positive or negative, into this review process?
I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. I think Trump is very focused on midterms in November, on what he needs to do to energize the voters. He knows that the domestic economy is a major concern. He's worried that the investment pipeline that he thinks he's created for factories in the US may not be felt, may not deliver quickly enough to make a difference, that the cost of living is a big issue. I think those are the things he's going to be focused on much more.
Definitely. Thank you, Michael. And precisely talking about this, how governments are navigating this rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape and these U.S. priorities. Jacqueline, let me turn back to you. So politically and diplomatically, how do you see Caribbean governments positioning themselves in 2026 amid those that I was talking about, shifting priorities, growing global competition? We were just talking too about how the U.S. might want to counteract U.S. influence in the region. How do you see Caribbean governments positioning themselves among that?
Well, we already see Caribbean governments positioning themselves, which is basically giving in to the Trump administration on the issue of migration. I mean, right now, as we speak, that's the biggest issue right now, and that's the biggest concession that they are making. Even in terms of the reaction with Venezuela, this has always been a divisive issue because we had the Petrocaribe, oil program that Venezuela funded in a lot of Caribbean and Central American countries for so long. And you saw that they sort of walked a very fine line. I mean, critics said that, CARICOM statements weren't really that strong. Interesting enough, after January 3rd, for instance, we never heard anything out of the Haitian government. They are very dependent on this relationship with the United States, with Trump administration in particular, because while we talk about them sort of owning Venezuela, we see with Haiti, they want to control it, but they don't want to own it. And we see with the gang suppression force, how Rubio really went out to really get support from the international community to transform, this international mission there. But with the rest of the Caribbean, again, I think it's going to be wait and see. I mean, first Trump, we saw divide and conquer. Remember the famous meeting at Mar-a-Lago where you had 5 leaders in the region who were invited to meet with President Trump and the others were not. But now what we're seeing is more and more of them sort of caving in. But I think we just need to wait. And we did not really talk about Cuba. And I just want to say something quickly, in reference to the whole Venezuela situation. Everybody's looking at Cuba. And we saw what happened over the weekend with President Trump basically saying to Cuba, hey, it's time to make a deal. I think Cuba is definitely going to be an issue to watch. The problem with Cuba is that the military, my colleague, Nora Gomez-Torres, basically wrote an explosive investigation about how the military is controlling $18 billion. So while it's one thing to put pressure on the civilian government in Cuba, you're going to have to deal with the military, but we're going to have to see how Mexico, even Venezuela, these other countries and Caribbean countries that have been very supportive of Cuba, very outspoken about the embargo, what their position is going to be in the coming days, weeks, and months, vis-a-vis the pressure that the U.S. is putting on Cuba, and what is going to be the pressure point for President Trump as far as Cuba. Are we going to see another situation that happened in Venezuela in Cuba, or will it be a little bit more diplomatic with more of an involvement of the Cuban American community that we know is very powerful, especially here in Miami?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Jacqueline. And I think that kind of brings us full circle into what we started the conversation with when I was asking Courtney about the national security strategy. So let me pick on Jacqueline's point to move about how the U.S. is thinking about the region as a whole. So Courtney, let me turn to you again. You were just talking about how the U.S. was deploying all of these military assets into the Caribbean. You know, we have a big show of force in the region there, but there's also going to be other global priorities. So, from your reporting, how are U.S. defense officials thinking about expanding engagement in Latin America while managing those other global priorities? And where do you think, if any, are maybe trade-offs or constraints in these priorities?
It's remarkable. So I've covered the military and the Pentagon for over 20 years, almost 21 years now. And this is the first time in that time where there has been such an emphasis on the Western Hemisphere. In fact, for the most part, U.S. Southern Command is one of the under-resourced commands, combatant commands. People don't pay a lot of attention to Southcom. So it's been remarkable to see how the shift has happened. And what's even more remarkable is where some of these assets are coming from. So look at what's happening right now. President Trump is being asked about and talking about the possibility of U.S. military action in Iran because of the protest, in support of the protests who are protesting the regime there. The U.S. pulled quite a bit of military hardware out of the Central Command region to put it down into the Western Hemisphere, to put it in advance of Venezuela. And most of it has not moved back out, despite the fact the president has said that there's not going to be a second wave. As I said, they're still going to continue with this Operation Southern Spear, going after the drug boats. They're still going to go after the tankers. They're maintaining this huge military presence there. And the reality is, this is what the military tends to do, what they call deterrence. They are hoping that if they have this big presence there, if they have surface ships, if they have submarines, if they have F-35s, that maybe they can stop whatever kind of activity they're worried about. In this case, we've heard about several different reasons that they have them there, and one of them is the drug trade. But they have pulled troops and almost more importantly, some really serious military assets out of CENTCOM, put them down to the Western Hemisphere, put them down towards Venezuela. So I do not see any indication that that is slowing at all. We've seen a little bit of the support. So tankers, air tankers, some helicopters that have moved back to their other locations. I would not be surprised if we see even more capabilities if they need to keep putting more troops and assets down in the Southern Command area. I think that we will see more taken out of AFRICOM, U.S. Africa Command, which is already now just not a priority theater, and frankly, realistically, has not been for some time for the White House. And that's not just the Trump White House, frankly. I wouldn't be surprised if we see more shift out of Europe. That is obviously something that the Trump administration has not prioritized and has talked openly about how they want to pull their footprint out of, or at least decrease their footprint there. And I would not be surprised if we see even more and more brought into the Western Hemisphere. I was really struck last week when Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth were on the Hill, and someone asked about the cost of this increased military buildup in the Western Hemisphere. And Secretary Hegseth became very defensive about it and immediately said, there is no cost. They're home. This is our hemisphere. Well, that's just not the case. There's always going to be the cost if you have forces who are deployed, even if they're in the Caribbean Sea. But I see that as one of the talking points going forward. They see this as the U.S. military home in this hemisphere, and that will be the priority going forward, unless something else happens that knocks their attention elsewhere.
Extremely interesting. Thank you, Courtney. And I want to stay on U.S. engagement in the hemisphere, but move from the broader strategic picture to a specific country that, Eric, actually, you were just talking about Panama earlier. So let me kind of pick on that and follow up a little bit, because it has been drawing increasing attention in Washington and from the Trump administration. So after Venezuela, do you think Panama could be next on the U.S. agenda in the Western Hemisphere, focusing maybe on the canal security, port activity, broader concerns around the Chinese influence that we were talking about earlier?
Sure, Salome, I'd like to draw on a couple of great observations made in the last few minutes by both Javier and by Courtney. I think Javier is exactly right about talking about two types of countries in terms of the way that Secretary Rubio and the way that the administration sees the region. And Panama is very much the Molino administration, very much trying to position itself into the type of countries that are allied with the US. We see this from the bottom of the hemisphere, from Milei in Argentina with the extraordinary loan by Treasury, the extraordinary support from Treasury in 2025, before the midterm elections, with Chile, with having just voted for Cast, up through Paraguay, Bolivia, and that Panama is really trying to position itself to be a US ally and part of the solution rather than part of the problem or in some kind of unaligned middle ground. And so while there was that focus from President Trump on Panama and the canal during the transition, that seems to have quieted down. We're still seeing actually China obstructing this sale of CK Hutchison ports to BlackRock, which was agreed back in March of last year, and some legal processes there, but Panama in favor of that going forward. And so Panama seems to have quieted down to some extent. But drawing on what Courtney said about assets in the Western Hemisphere, one takeaway that I have from covering State Department and foreign policy this past year is that for this administration, as is outlined in the National Security Strategy, the first regional section of that strategy is the Western Hemisphere. And when you talk with people about the other hotspots around the world, places that have received more coverage and attention, perhaps rightfully so in recent decades, the Middle East, Gaza, Israel, Ukraine, and the conflict there, that the administration, to some sense, sees these conflicts as things that it wants to resolve. Of course, President Trump said he hoped to resolve them on day one, to resolve those in order to move attention to what the administration considers philosophically to be the most important parts of the world, and that is the Western Hemisphere, because it is the U.S. home, and also the Indo-Pacific. But of course, plans like those that are laid out on paper get interrupted by the need to have assets in other parts of the world. And of course, to be supportive of the Iranian protesters, the Iranian people in the street protesting the regime there. But it's a different way of thinking about the Western Hemisphere that is different from, and a paradigm shift from anything that I've covered in 15 years being based in Mexico City and Washington, covering events in the region, and is just a new way of thinking that I think everyone is adjusting to.
Definitely. And let me take from those answers about the relationships to turn to Javier. And Javier, I have one question from one of our audience who sent it. So I'm going to ask that one and then we'll move to the other question. And so Juan asks, do you anticipate President Trump making explicit endorsements of candidates in Costa Rica election? I'm asking this because we talked earlier, of course, about elections. And besides Costa Rica, let me just ask you the second question so you can kind of give us a broad answer. But Mexico, as we said, is also at the center of U.S. engagement in the hemisphere this year, particularly as Washington increases pressure around cartels and drug trafficking. So what do you think is it that the United States is expecting from Mexico, and how is the Mexican government going to respond to that pressure in the next couple months?
Thank you, Salome, and thank you, Juan, for your question. I'm not sure he will, President Trump will position himself on Costa Rica unless he's asked to. So probably in one of these press availabilities or questions with reporters, if somebody asks about Costa Rica, he might give an answer. Now about Mexico, I think Mexican authorities are trying to recalibrate their position and message after what happened in Caracas. The New York Times had a very good article yesterday about this issue, and Mexico knows they need to cooperate with Washington's priorities. Also, Washington is saying that Mexico cooperates more than ever. That seems to be good, at least on one level, which is the level of public statements. But in other levels of the bilateral relation, there are certainly some tensions, right? So as you may know, President Trump, every time he has a chance, he says that Mexico is being controlled entirely by the drug cartels. And that is, let's say, partially true. As a Mexican journalist myself that covered during years in my country issues about violence, security, human rights, I know firsthand that there are entire regions of Mexico that are not controlled by the Mexican state, that are being controlled by these drug organizations. And also the cartels control indirectly the institutions with this plata or plomo premise. in which officials, local officials, state officials, federal officials are being offered this very difficult choice between accepting a bribe or accept the consequence. You're either corrupt or you die. So I think the situation in Mexico is very, very complex. It's not going to be solved by a military strike, by a military operation. Even if you capture at the same time all the most wanted drug lords in Mexico, that's not going to change a lot. But Washington will keep pushing for results, and there are some results already. President Sheinbaum talked last week about the 40% less homicides in the country. That's a number we have not seen in a decade. Last year, Mexico sent to the United States about 50 high-profile drug traffickers. So those are some results. And with this growing pressure, what I think is maybe the biggest challenge for Mexican authorities is that some high-ranking official or member of the official party is actually colluded or working with these drug organizations. And let me add just another level to these tensions I was talking about, which is Cuba. Mexico has become a key provider of oil, to Cuba, and that could add some tensions to the relation with the Trump administration. This issue is getting more and more attention. Eric has reported a lot about this, and now the issue is even being talked about in Capitol Hill. I asked Secretary Rubio directly about this issue. He didn't wanted to position himself directly, but I'm sure that Washington doesn't want any more oil going into Cuba.
Thank you, Javier. And before I jump into that, Jacqueline, can you add maybe anything about that perspective that Javier was bringing about the interest that might play out in the Caribbean with these relationships at play?
Well, no, I agree with Javier, especially when we look at in terms of Cuba. I mean, the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean has basically been more sort of a solidarity in terms of their support, for Cuba. But, Mexico is going to be in a very tight position. Do you continue to provide oil to Cuba when, today Cuba is in a very fragile state? Yes, it's been like that for 25 years. But when we see what's happening inside Cuba, and of course, remember, it just got struck by Hurricane Melissa, that has made things, even worse, the constant rollout of the blackouts. So how fragile is that? And the U.S. is now looking and pushing to see some movement, in Cuba. But again, I don't see at this point Caribbean governments are going to really stick their necks out that far for somebody else. I mean, right now, they themselves are in a very vulnerable situation. They're walking this sort of fine line between their own relationships, with China, but this need to continue to have this relationship with the United States. They're dealing with crime. They're dealing with increased gun trafficking, illegal trafficking that's coming mostly from the U.S. They need to have this cooperation. So they're really just trying to see, like, okay, how can we just keep our head above water? And at the end of the day, we want to be able to protect our citizens. Remember that there are several countries that this administration put on a partial travel ban. We didn't talk about that, but you've got, Venezuela, Cuba, you've got Haiti that has a full travel ban, which means that anyone that does not have a U.S. Visa at this point is not going to get it as long as this travel ban is in place. We also had Antigua and Dominica, and Antigua and Dominica were two countries that actually, agreed, to this, this third party, agreement for migrants to come in. And the administration used the Citizenship by Investment program. There are 5 countries in the region that are under this program. So right now, Caribbean countries are really like trying to figure out how to navigate the changing dynamics that's happening in Washington, and trying to understand what does that mean for them and what does that mean for their citizens.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you for building up on that too. We have a couple minutes left, and before we wrap up, I want to turn back to one economic aspect that is big in Latin America, and that is Argentina, which we have not covered. So I want to turn to Michael. Very quick, Michael. In our 10 questions for 2026 publications, we noted that Argentina has reached a point where deeper economic reforms can no longer move forward through executive action alone. Progress now depends on whether President Javier Milei can secure congressional backing, something markets are watching closely. So, Michael, as Milei enters his second year in office, what are the clearest signals you're seeing that this economic shock therapy is either consolidating or running into political and social limits in 2026? And how much hinges on what happens in the Argentinian Congress in the early months of the year?
Thanks, Salome. Well, I interviewed President Milei in October and found a man who was extraordinarily confident and secure and convinced he was doing the right thing, buoyed by his midterm election victory that gave him, for the first time, a lot more weight in Congress and a real possibility of passing legislation. He passed a budget for the first time since he took office. He got enough support in Congress to do that. He's got the congressional wind in his sails now. He's in Argentina over New Year. And I'd say, again, sort of anecdotally, one of the interesting things now is it almost feels normal, which for Argentina is extraordinary, right? This was a place that was almost collapsing with hyperinflation. It had the weirdest system of exchange rates. People were carting around huge amounts of local currency that was almost worthless. They were looking for black market exchange dealers, down side streets. Most of that has disappeared. It's sort of inflation's under control. People are using cards again, electronic cards. The formal economy has sort of returned. The big question, I think, is, as well as the congressional political side, which Milei at the moment seems to have more under control, can he get people to invest? Can he get business people to open their wallets? At the moment, people are still taking money out. There's a lot of foreign investors trapped in Argentina, couldn't get their money out because of exchange controls, taking advantage of the liberalization to get their money out of the country. Not many people outside oil and gas and mining putting money in. And there's a big question about whether there's enough confidence. People have been burnt on Argentina so many times that they're very reluctant to put serious amounts of money on the table until they can be convinced that this is for real and that it's going to last. And Argentina's election cycle, with elections every 2 years, midterms or presidential and congressional, makes it hard to do that. People are already starting to think about, what about the next election, 2028? Will Milei win? Can he stay in office or not? Will the Peronists come back? So that's his challenge, I think, to convince people that there's enough of a sort of solid basis here, enough of a national consensus around his reforms that they're going to last and that it's worth investing for the long term.
Thank you, Michael, for bringing those insights about Argentina as well. And I am afraid we have run out of time, and I know we could all easily continue this conversation for hours on each topic. So I really do appreciate and thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers for sharing your insights. And we will certainly be following your reporting closely on these issues throughout the year. Before we sign off, don't forget to follow our social media series, America's Minute and Venezuela Weekly, where we are bringing you quick analysis on the top stories of the week. And remember to also subscribe to our newsletter to see upcoming events related to these topics as well, and to the Atlantic Council's daily newsletter, AC Intel, for the latest insights from our experts. Thank you again to our speakers. Thank you to everybody tuning in for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.